Hi, Monica. There you are.
There I am.
How are you?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
Good. I'm going to go ahead and make you a co-host.
Okay, that's great. I'm gonna actually turn down my lights a little bit. It feels a little bright in
Yeah.
here. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, let's get started. Welcome everyone to the third in our series of web events. I'm Monica Medina from Our Daily Planet, a daily environmental email newsletter that I hope you'll all subscribe to. We co-sponsor these events with Third Way and the University of Michigan. And as I said, this is the third in our events entitled Responding to the Crisis. Today, we're looking at the issues surrounding labor, clean energy, and the American worker during the COVID-19 recovery. And we are really fortunate to have a great panel with us today, and I'm going to introduce them and then I'll tell you our format. First, we'll hear from John Gray, who is the Director of Legislation at the SEIU. Also, we have with us today Jessica Ekdish, who is the Director of Legislation at the Blue-Green Alliance. And lastly, we have Roland Zullo, who is the Director at the Center for Labor and Community Studies at the University of Michigan. So I want to welcome all of them and welcome all of you. Thank you very much. So we'll have about 30 minutes of a panel discussion, and then we'll open it up to Q&As from the audience for about 15 minutes. We've had a chance in the past, and we've always been able to take audience questions, and we look forward to that. But hold your questions until about 1 o'clock when we'll be able to get to them. So let me just start by saying that this has been a hard week for workers in this country. The job numbers that came out today were unfortunately another 3.8 million unemployment claims were filed this week. So Americans are continuing to lose their jobs, and more than 30 million Americans have lost their jobs in the last 2 months. At the same time, we're also seeing states reopening, at least partially. 6 states are reopening at some level today, and 31 states in total will be reopening in the next few days. So workers have been asked to come back to work even if they don't have the appropriate personal protective equipment, and there aren't precautions in place or even enough tests yet in most states. So these are very challenging times for American labor. And we're fortunate to have this wonderful panel here to discuss some of the issues. So first we want to talk about what are some of the immediate needs to keep jobs and to ensure the safety of union workers. So John, I'm going to ask you to tell us about how the members of the SEIU are dealing with the crisis. What types of workers do you represent, and how are federal stimulus funds working or not to protect workers right now? And I want to just say quickly, I am a member of the SEIU as a function of being an adjunct faculty member at Georgetown University. So I'm proud to be a union member myself.
I knew I was going to do that. Forget to unmute. Thank you, Monica. Thanks for inviting me to participate on this call. We appreciate your being a member, and we also appreciate the work that you do on this particular website and the programs that you offer. SEIU is the very large union. It's the second largest in the country, and it is a very diverse union that has membership across the country geographically, as well as in the various segments of the economy. We're the largest healthcare union in the country. We have interns, residents, nurses, home health care people, adjunct faculty, as you mentioned. And then we also have janitors and security guards, home health care workers, people who work in nursing homes, corrections officers. So we're like all over the gamut. And obviously many of those positions are in places that require them to be in active engagement with the public in various ways that put them at extreme risk. Corrections officers comes to mind because actually that's another sort of crisis that we haven't thought about so much, but is happening and is really a part of it. So we've been involved in both crises, and I say both crises because there are two. There's a health crisis that's happening, and there's an economic crisis that's happening, and the Congress has been trying to address them both in, the government has been trying to address them both and with relative degrees of success. What you mentioned about the money that's being spent on health care, public health, we've been trying to make sure that that's done in the best way possible, to make sure it covers as many people as possible. As you know, you can't have a public health response that doesn't include the entire public, because that's not a public health response. And so that's one of the things that we've been grappling with, to make sure that you're talking to, including immigrants in some cases that have been left out because they're not being considered, as well as folks who are inside prisons who actually are a part of the public and can end up impacting the entire system that we are addressing. So on the public health front, we're trying to make sure that everyone is covered, and the people who are working directly involved with the public have the right equipment to do their jobs. And that's been a struggle, and we continue to have that struggle. Then there's an economic struggle, and that has to do with how people get their health care through their jobs, and how do we keep them connected to their employment as we reopen. And that's the best way for people to stay, for people to stay economically healthy, but it's also the best way for the economy to be able to perform if people have that connection. And so there are these programs that help employers that are inclined to stay, to keep employees attached to them by paying their salaries in some way or fashion, or paying for their health care. Those are the kinds of things that we've been engaged in, and I will continue to do that. I think that gets at your question. That's the kind of stuff that we're working on, but it's such a broad swath of things that you have to consider because there are these two crises that are happening at the same time. I'll stop there.
Thank you. I had to do the same thing and unmute. So John, I want to stick with you for one more second to talk about union members, particularly in frontline communities. We've read a lot about how in the past they've had, in frontline communities, they've had problems with unsafe air quality and drinking water that isn't up to par. And those things are particularly important now in the midst of the crisis. Wondered if you could comment on that. How are union members impacted by the pollution that we see in our country today?
Well, absolutely. And that is also connected to this, because what this crisis has done is shown us the places that we haven't done as good a job as we'd like on helping people stay safe and helping people be healthy. We represent a lot of folks in Flint, Michigan, and obviously about the water challenges that happen in Flint and in other communities all over the country, where the idea that we have to wash our hands more is a thing that we all think we just need to do, but it's not so easy in some places to say that that's a solution when water is not so secure, and water and sending people back to water when they're just trying to get it has been a challenge. The same thing goes for communities where folks have always struggled with being in the parts of the communities that have the most impact on environmental pollution. The communities, the east side of Houston comes to mind for me. I'm from Texas, but there are all these other places that have a disproportionate impact of what's been happening based on pollution that's happening to them. We have to keep those things in mind when we start creating solutions for this problem that we're having right at the moment. And remember that marginalized communities are always marginalized when we have a crisis. they start out marginalized, they become more marginalized as we try to up solutions. And so we've been dealing with that, and we've been listening to our members who have told us some of the challenges that they experience. I'll give an example, and this is not an environmental example, but it's an example that is the same. In some cases, the airport workers that we represent in some cities are from immigrant populations. Some immigrant populations that speak languages that are not very popular, not very well known. Somali, Urdu, all these places. When we start giving instructions to workers about things they need to do on the job and off, we have to consider that, and we have to consider it in a way that allows them to do their work or also to be safe. So we try to bring that to the fore when we're working on this, and that's been a consideration for us.
Thanks, John. I know that people don't often think about the fact that not all workers speak English or even the same few languages that maybe most of us are familiar with. So Jessica, I want to turn to you and ask you a little bit about the work that you do at Blue Green Alliance, and tell us about what you think are the issues in terms of worker safety for those workers who are essential and have to remain on the job. Wondering if you all have a notion about whether, as a policy matter, OSHA rules are sufficiently protective now, given the pandemic.
Thanks for that question, Monica, and I'm happy to be here today. In short, to answer your question, no, they are completely insufficient. So Blue Green Alliance is a national partnership of labor unions and environmental organizations. And the labor unions that are part of our alliance, we're proud to have SEIU as one of our partners. They represent workers across the board as broad and diverse a set of workers as John laid out. And across the board, we're hearing from essential workers, from healthcare providers to grocery workers to workers in emergency services, transportation, food processing, manufacturing, really across the board, that they're lacking personal protection equipment. They're essentially working in unsafe conditions. A recent media investigation identified more than 3,000 COVID-19 related OSHA complaints just since the beginning of this year. Yeah, so and this week too, we saw a particular spotlight cast on the meatpacking industry when we saw the Trump administration take action to essentially force these workers back to work, and you alluded to this, Monica, in unsafe conditions. So bottom line, workers are risking their lives every day during this crisis just trying to work. So we at the Blue Green Alliance and many of our partners have been calling on OSHA to really do its job. To date, they've issued guidance. That guidance is voluntary. It is not enforceable. So we've called on OSHA to do three things in particular. One, to immediately issue and enforce compliance with an emergency standard to protect all frontline workers. And there's been legislation introduced in Congress that would make progress towards this end. Two, to use OSHA's existing authority to inspect and enforce to ensure that employers are complying with existing agency standards. And third, to work with Congress to provide additional funding to the states that administer their own OSHA plans. So we've called on OSHA to do these things. We think there's some concrete actions that could be taken right now to make sure that workers that are working today are more safe on the job. At the same time, we know this isn't new. As John was saying, this pandemic has really just brought to light the fact that the laws and systems that we have in place in this country are insufficient across the board, and expose the cracks, or really the gaping holes in our social safety net and our workplace safety requirements in this country. So not only do we need to take these actions to protect workers today, but we fully believe that we should be investing to improve this system for the future. So to us, that means fully funding and reinvesting in the public sector and public services, including OSHA, but other federal agencies at the federal and the state levels, expanding workers' rights and representation. Unions make workplaces safer. One study found that a 1 percentage point increase in the unionized workforce was associated with a 2.8% decline in the rate of occupational fatalities. So we should be supporting the right to organize throughout the economy, removing policy barriers, promoting productive policies to ensure that workers have a meaningful voice on the job. And finally, we should be investing in training, equipment, preparedness, plan development, all of the tools, including through registered apprenticeship programs that we need to make sure that we have a robust, skilled and well-prepared workforce moving forward. So we see a lot of need and opportunity both to make sure that workers are protected on the job today and are improving the system moving forward for the future as well.
Wow. Thank you so much. And it's really interesting to think about environment. Most people think of it as the outdoors, but for workers, their environment is also their indoor environment and the pollutants and the things they're exposed to inside these facilities. Roland, thanks so much for your patience while we've been making our way through the panel. What you do really is sort of look at these on a systemic or, kind of a wider basis. Looking at communities and worker rights. I'm wondering if you could tell us, particularly now as plants are starting to reopen, manufacturing is getting up and going again in some states. What are the challenges for workers as their plants and other workspaces open up again? How hard is it for employers to ensure their safety, and how hard is it for workers to make sure they are safe?
Well, we have some knowledge because during this pandemic, there are some manufacturing facilities that have remained open, in part because they're considered essential. For example, steel making is considered essential, although many of the manufacturing operations have shut down, most of them beginning in March in the auto industry here in Michigan. One of the challenges in a manufacturing environment is that it's hard to follow all the CDC guidelines for safe practice, keeping a proper distance, making sure everything that you touch and work with is clean and sanitized. That can be very difficult, but we have some best practices out there from the workers who have been involved all along in these essential services. And what they tell us is that sanitation is very important. And along with that, it's important that workers at each station have the sanitation equipment they need to keep things clean. They also stress the importance of communication. Communication on a number of levels. Communication first for best practices, but also communication if someone does come down with the virus, that there's communication that goes out to anyone that may have come in contact with a person who has the virus, so that they can look for the symptoms in themselves and their family members. And in situations though where you can't keep 6 feet apart, and so the social distancing doesn't work, what we're seeing in the manufacturing environment is employers are requiring those workers to wear the protective gear, the face shields, the masks, and in some cases putting up barriers between the workers. So that's what's happening. And of course, keeping any kind of common area sanitized. Cleaning that very often is important. I'm certain that all the companies thinking of going back online in May hopefully they're taking many of these precautions into consideration.
Yeah, that's great information. The best practices are probably ones that are really needed to be publicized now, and particularly the point about communications. I know that that's an important thing in a good time for workers to get the communications from their supervisors and bosses and the leaders in their industry. And I would imagine that now that's more important than ever. And
what they tell us, and Monica, what they tell us is that posters and leaflets aren't good enough. That it's really very important for union leaders and supervisors to also contact workers, firsthand, and to continually remind them of these measures and what to do.
Yeah, that's great advice. Wonderful. Thank you, Roland. So thinking about sort of the next wave, and when we created these events, we really were thinking ahead, trying to get ahead of the challenges that we're going to face as we try to turn our economy around. Jessica, this panel is called Labor and Clean Energy and the American Worker. And I wonder how we ensure that as we recover from the crisis, that we get benefits for both workers and the environment and climate change in particular. I know you think a lot about this at the Blue Green Alliance.
We do, yes, thanks, Monica. This is really what we're all about. We were founded on the idea that no one should have to choose between a good job and a clean environment. We can have both of those things, and we have to have both of those things. And that's really how we come to this conversation. You know, we've been really keeping our focus on addressing working people's and families' immediate needs. And I think that's where, you know, most of the conversation has rightly been. At the same time, you know, you raised the latest job numbers today. Millions of people are already out of work, and we have to also start thinking long-term about how we provide ongoing security for workers and families and put people back to work. And I'll just say it again, you know, this crisis has demonstrated what we already knew, which was that our economy already wasn't working for too many people. And we went into this pandemic already with several other crises, climate change, economic inequality. So for us, when we think about economic recovery, we're focused on how do we create good union jobs, and also how do we make investments in a way that we come out of this crisis stronger, more resilient, and more competitive as a society, and with a stronger, fairer, and cleaner economy. So one of the ways that we really think about that is infrastructure, investing in our infrastructure. Investing across our infrastructure systems can create millions of jobs, not just critically in the building and construction trades, but in the manufacturing of the materials that go into our infrastructure systems, and really across the economy, services. So at the same time, repairing infrastructure from our water systems to our energy grid to schools, buildings, natural infrastructure, you name it. Investing in those systems also reaps benefits, we know, for our climate, for public health, for our natural environment. For example, transit ridership saves the equivalent energy of gasoline used by more than 7.7 million cars a year. It also reduces other toxic air pollution from vehicles that we know disproportionately fall on people of color and low-income communities. So there's a real nexus here for jobs, equity, climate, environmental health, public health. For us, we also really think about how we make these investments, and we think about how we make these investments in a way that really maximizes benefits for workers and communities. So a few of the ways that we do that, and we think about doing that, and something that we're really looking for in any kind of package that might move, is longstanding Buy America requirements, Davis-Bacon prevailing wage requirements, local hire, project labor agreements, hiring and procurement policies that really benefit low-income communities, people of color, women-owned businesses. So the kinds of measures that help ensure that public investments not only create jobs, but create good jobs, strengthen domestic manufacturing, and have positive outcomes for our communities. So those are some of the ways that we're thinking about this conversation.
Those are great. As someone who is a woman who owns a business, you're speaking my language. So thanks for those recommendations. Those are really interesting policy ideas, and we don't have to reinvent the wheel. I think that's the most the thing I take away from the list of things that you mentioned there. There are things that are tried and true that have been proven to work in the past. So Roland, I wanted to ask you a little bit about the diversity of views within the union membership world. That unions are not monolithic. I wonder what you think it will take to get unions to unite around a cleaner, more efficient economy going forward, using the kinds of tools that Jessica was just talking about.
Yeah, I think when you look across the labor movement and how they approach progressive ideas to address climate change, species extinction, and so forth, the difficulties we face as a globe, right? I think you can probably place unions in three different sort of camps. There's the group that have been out there pretty much ahead of the curve, advocating for change, positive change to help deal with climate change. There's the group that will just they're defending their members, and so they'll never probably buy into programs like the Green New Deal. Then there's a sort of a large group that are just sort of sitting there waiting for everything to sort of happen, and they'll respond to what's going on. And I think if you want to bring more unions into the fold, I would add to what Jessica had said that, you know, for any kind of program in any kind of proposal, adding something like a neutrality agreement for any company that's involved, or any kind of card check requirement for any company that signs on to this and receives federal funds to help with this, that would really help bring many people in the labor movement along. And then, you know, and then of course for those unions that that will be directly affected by any kind of attempt to reduce our dependency on fossil fuels, like the mine workers, I think you have to have a robust program for those members as well.
And what does that mean, a robust program? Do you mean, you know, transition, a just transition? Is that what they're looking for?
Well, you'd have to contact their union leaders, contact leadership to find out exactly what they would need. But I would think that they would want their members supported during any kind of transition away from fossil fuel.
Great. So John, your union does support the Green New Deal. And I'm just wondering if that was a hard decision, or was it something that came quite naturally, just given the nature of the workers that you all represent, and why? Why did you go ahead and take that step?
I don't think any decisions are easy decisions, because they involve lots of people. And our union is a big and broad one, and robust, lots of robust discussions that always happen. But it came to us more organically, because our membership were feeling the fact that they live in communities where these are challenges, or they're working at work, there are changes that are happening, and they saw it as the change is happening and coming. We need to be engaged in order for us to make sure that it doesn't affect us poorly, and that it affects us in a good way. And so I think their various locals saw that and decided that that's something that we need to be involved in. I described some of the various jobs that are included in our union, and among them are property service people, and, you know, who take care of buildings in New York. And you know, if their employers are going to make changes because they want to be more environmentally attuned, then our workforce was saying we want to be able to benefit from those kinds of changes. And so, for instance, in that case, we made a partnership. Some of our locals have made a partnership with LEED to find out how to become the best property service people for buildings that were going to be LEED certified. And so it just bubbled up in so many different places. You know, we also represent folks who are in hospitals. Hospitals are huge consumers of energy. They are under the gun to figure out something. And so our workers want to be able to be engaged in that conversation rather than brought along or left behind. And so that's kind of the way that we came to it. And we were able to persuade, you know, everything happens through resolutions. Folks were able to understand why this was a good idea, and we were able to take a stance and believe that we could help individuals in the union as well as the country if we were to be engaged.
That's great. It sounds like your members wanted to be really engaged in solutions to some of these problems. It's good to see. So John or Jessica, I'm going to toss this to you, either of you, or maybe both of you. What else do you think should be in a future stimulus bill that creates jobs? What other types of new jobs would you be looking for? I know, Jessica, you mentioned infrastructure. John, what other types might you be looking for? Either one of you.
Well, I'll tell you, for us, the first order of business is to preserve the jobs that people have. And that is those descriptions that I gave you of the programs that try to help people stay connected to their job. And it's the smart way to do some of these things because it's a better way. People should be connected to their jobs. It may cost as much or maybe less than unemployment insurance, but it's certainly better for those families, and it's also better for the economy when we try to bring get it back going. So that's our first and a primary focus. Then, of course, protections for people who have to go back to work because we still haven't fixed that situation. Then the two big things that you have to do as we go into this next phase is provide leave. Paid leave and paid sick leave still haven't been provided for most workers. And you really, you sort of set yourself up to repeat the same problem again if people can't stay home and take care of themselves or their family if they're sick. That means they go to the workplace, they infect other people, et cetera, et cetera. So we, this moment has taught us that the things that we thought were important are even more important because they are part of a public health response. That's our first focus, and so then as far as going forward with other jobs, we believe that infrastructure should be thought of broadly and not in terms of the same infrastructure bill that we would have done in the 1950s that we're doing in 2020. And infrastructure is different because the world is different and our country is different. And it involves childcare. It involves making sure that people have all the kinds of supports they need in order for the economy to run well. And so we believe in the care infrastructure as well in the jobs going forward, because I think it means it's just a way to think about this in terms of the future rather than in terms of the past.
So Jessica, I want to toss that to you as well, because you listed some other categories. You had infrastructure, but then you also talked about green infrastructure and maybe some clean energy type jobs that you think are ripe for this kind of help from a next stimulus package.
Yeah, well, I want to wholeheartedly second what John just said and maybe just offer one additional thing. So in addition to kind of the traditional infrastructure that we often think of, the care infrastructure, which I really love referring to it that way, the care infrastructure that John was just talking about. Maybe a third area that we're particularly focused on, and just to build on what Roland was saying earlier about the manufacturing sector, is clean manufacturing jobs. I think the COVID crisis has also cast a spotlight on the real gaps and risks we have in our supply chain, our manufacturing supply chain. The industrial sector is also an enormous source of greenhouse gas emissions and a growing source of greenhouse gas emissions. So we see a real opportunity to invest in retooling, reshoring, rebuilding American manufacturing, both to create good jobs, manufacturing the technologies of today and tomorrow, but also investing to make our manufacturing the cleanest and most competitive in the world. So that's another area that we're really focused on, in addition to infrastructure and care infrastructure as well.
That's great. I don't think people often think about the fact that manufacturing could get a lot cleaner and more efficient than it is today. I'm going to stop for a minute and just say to our audience members, if you have questions, you can submit them via the Q&A function on the Zoom video conference. So please go ahead and send them. And while you're sending them, I'm going to ask the panelists one last overall question, and that has to do with what happens if we go through another wave of COVID in the fall. What should people be doing now to prepare for that? What should we be thinking about in terms of workers and worker rights and worker safety if we were to face another wave of COVID in the fall? So maybe I'll start with you, John, and then go through each panelist and see what you think about that.
Sure. So I think that you know, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but it sort of reinforces the need for, you know, it's like if we don't fix the things that we have been asking for all along, which is protective equipment for people who have to go to work, testing for everyone who needs to be tested so we can know who has who's been exposed and who hasn't, and paid leave and paid sick, then we're bound to have these double dip experience of the disease. And so it's sort of like that to me is like, you got to have that, you got to have that. The other thing that I'm concerned about is there's a movement to try to limit liability by businesses for even after we haven't provided these same workers with the kinds of protections that they need. The idea that they would be exposed, and then the companies that would have, you know, that their employers would not be liable for that kind of position is kind of crazy, but that's kind of where we are now. That's a conversation that is being had. And so that's why we have to make sure that we deal with that.
Yeah, that's an issue we didn't even really get a chance to touch on, but the question of liability and whether there ought to be liability for unsafe conditions going forward for workers is a really tough one, an interesting one, an important one for worker safety and for the public safety. So Roland, let me ask you, what do you think we ought to be thinking about in terms of the future if there were another wave?
Yeah, well, and you're seeing it here from the panelists, people like John and Jessica, who are very much involved in the union movement, and of course yourself. Going back to something that was said earlier, you know, one of the problems with OSHA is it exists, but it's terribly underfunded. And so non-union workers really cannot count on OSHA protecting them. So, you know, right now would be a time, I would hope, when workers begin to join unions. And unfortunately, though, we have an administration that is appointing people to the NLRB that's writing laws and rules that are making it more difficult for workers to join. So if we wanted to prepare for what may happen in the autumn with another spike, I would suggest that we make it easier for workers to form and join unions where they then have a voice to defend themselves.
That's great, because I know union membership has been stronger in the past. It would be really good to see it come back in this new economy. Jessica, how about you?
Yeah, well, I'll double down on what has been said already on OSHA, work health and safety, the role of unions. I'll maybe add two things. One would be, you know, we've called for fully utilizing the Defense Production Act to really ramp up our manufacturing of PPE, testing everything that we need right now and may need again in the future. Not using it in the way that the administration did this week, but actually using it to shore up our critical supply chains. And then third, or the second thing I would add would be resources, more funding for state and local governments, both to respond to the crisis right now, but to prepare for what may come down the road.
Yeah, state and local governments are right in the center of where a lot of the action is, both in dealing with the crisis and in trying to help people in their communities. So we do have a question for Roland. The question is, does Southeast Michigan have any unique opportunities for leadership in climate and labor? And if so, what kinds of investment, private investment, I guess, or maybe government, public investment are needed in order for that to happen?
Yeah, one of the initiatives that I'm connected with here in Southeast Michigan is the University of Michigan has pledged to be net zero carbon by, I think it's 2025. And we're engaged. Now, so most of this involves building retrofit, but it's actually much larger than that because it includes things like landscaping, planting more trees and so forth. But most of it is taking the existing buildings here, and we have 3 campuses, the major campus in Ann Arbor and then Flint and Dearborn. So it's a rather large project. And so engaging with the building trades to make that happen. And so many of the building trades have already invested in training for this type of work. So we're trying to make that all happen here in Southeast Michigan.
Wow, that's really interesting. We have another question. This one's for you, John. John, do you all represent the workers at the meatpacking plants? And if not, who does? And are you, or is one of the other unions going to challenge what the president did this week to force those plants to open even when they had outbreaks of COVID there and were struggling?
Thank you for that question. We do not represent the folks at those meatpacking plants. I would believe that it's probably the United Food and Commercial Workers, the UFCW, that would represent those groups. And I know they're very active and very engaged in that issue, among others, but you'd have to ask them about exactly what their plans were.
Interesting. So Jessica, we have one for you, which is what specific proposals is the Blue-Green Alliance developing now in the area of clean energy and carbon neutrality, and how are you getting labor unions behind those?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So as I mentioned, we've been particularly focused on policies and priorities around abating the crisis on the ground right now, but we have been sending up to the Hill a number of priorities, and we've released a letter and a set of priorities publicly that I'm happy to share with anyone that hasn't seen those. But a suite of priorities really focusing on both recovery and, like I said, kind of coming out of this crisis in a way that we're actually stronger as a society and that we're tackling the other crises that we know we're in the midst of: climate change and economic inequality. So we've laid out a number of specific priorities in a handful of buckets. So infrastructure is one where there's a huge opportunity for clean energy jobs, whether that's through tackling some of our kind of traditional energy systems, water, transportation, growing transit, electric vehicle, charging infrastructure, but also grid modernization, both building out transmission systems, as well as modernizing our grid, making it more resilient, building out our energy storage systems and capacities. So we think there's a tremendous amount of opportunity there, as well as in the clean energy manufacturing that I mentioned as well. So I'm happy to share our document that lays out a number of specific policy recommendations in both of those buckets, but those are two of the particular areas that we've been focused on in terms of clean energy jobs.
That's great. And this is a question for you, Roland, about universities in general and whether they are going to be back in school in the fall, and if so, how will that be impacting their efforts to sort of green and become more green and more energy efficient?
Yeah, this COVID-19 pandemic has really thrown a great deal of turmoil into education generally. K through 12, but also universities. The university systems here in the state and across the country are under stress. That probably makes it far more difficult to engage in any kind of ambitious net zero carbon plan for the immediate future. In terms of classes, it's University of Michigan has not issued a statement yet about the fall, whether they will allow students to come back or whether it's still going to be all online. I believe Michigan State has and Wayne State have both said, or both plan on having online classes in the fall. What this does for us, what this does for universities, is it can make it difficult for us, for a university to justify the tuition that we're asking students to pay. And there are other sort of revenue problems that go along with the COVID-19 crisis that make it difficult for a university like Michigan to cover all of its costs. So this pandemic is throwing the university systems here into a sort of an era of uncertainty where we're all trying to chip in little ways to make this work.
Yeah, they're workers as well. It's not just professors or adjunct professors like me. It's thousands of people who keep the universities running that will be suffering if classes won't be back on campus in the fall. So thinking about them. We're almost at the end here. I just wanted to ask if any of the panelists had any final thoughts about this important topic of how we keep workers safe in the midst of this pandemic that we didn't get a chance to cover today so far in the questions, because it is something that I think will be top of mind for most Americans, either because they'll be returning to work or because they'll be dealing with the impact of not having a job in the foreseeable future. Anyone? Okay. All right. Well, let me just thank everyone for being here today. It's been a really interesting discussion. I've learned a lot and really appreciate the perspective that each of you brought to this conversation. It was wonderful, and all your work is really much appreciated. And let me just say to the audience, we will have in 2 weeks another session like this one, another web event in our series. That one will be on clean energy, climate, and environmental justice. And I'll be sending you all a link if you want to sign up for that right away, right after this. So please join us for that one. I think it'll be a continuation of this very interesting discussion about how COVID is impacting lots of different aspects of our economy and our communities. Thank you again for coming today, and appreciate very much everyone's participation in this panel. And everyone, please be well, be safe, and join us again in a couple of weeks when we continue this discussion. Thanks so much.
Bye now.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks, everybody.